So not too long ago, I made a YouTube short talking about how the Xbox One X was actually a great budget 4K gaming console, and a lot of people had a lot of opinions on it, especially when I said that the Xbox One X was more powerful than the Xbox Series S. So in this video, I want to expand on that YouTube short and maybe answer a question that quite a few people are asking, especially since the holiday season's over and Santa may not have brought you an Xbox Series X or S, which is the Xbox One X any good in 2025? Released back in 2017, I consider this iteration of the Xbox One to be the best version. Not just because of its specs, which we'll talk about a bit later, but also because it was done focusing on stupid gimmicks, Kinect, and it also showed that Microsoft was finally doing what they should have been doing from the very beginning of the 8th generation of consoles, which was focusing on games and the gamer. This was just a solid console with solid specs that played every game you threw at it, so I guess better late than never. Being Microsoft's answer to the PS4 Pro and their attempt at redemption, the specs were, and still are, kind of impressive for a console. I mean, this thing's got 12 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory, 40 compute units, higher memory bandwidth than the original Xbox One, which really isn't saying much, and 6 teraflops of floating point compute power, which is, as I said previously, more powerful than the Xbox Series S on paper. So what I said is technically correct, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And for 2017, this thing was no joke, and games from that era and even later look amazing. But the question, the one I asked at the beginning, still stands. Is it any good in 2025? Which I hope I said 2025 at the start, because I still keep saying 2024 every so often. Well, there are a few ways to look at it. The first one is by comparing it to the top-end consoles of the 9th generation, which is dumb. Like, seriously, that is stupid to do. Of course, the Xbox Series X and the PS5 are going to walk all over this nearly 8-year-old console. AMD Zen 2 versus old school Jaguar processor architecture, literally double the GPU power at 12 teraflops versus 6, and of course the modern NVMe SSD speeds versus spinning Rust. I mean, really, looking at it this way is no comparison at all. But the current generation of consoles are also $500. The reason I called the Xbox One X a budget 4K gaming console is because I was able to pick mine up for $160. So, of course, comparing the best of the last generation to the best of this generation is just a straight setup for failure. So because looking at it that way is really stupid, there's another way of looking at it, which is to compare it to the Xbox Series S. Looking at it this way does start to get a little more nuanced because the Xbox Series S is still more expensive, but not by much. It's $300 versus $100 to $200 depending on where you buy your Xbox One X from, and some people, like me, love the fact that the Xbox One X still has a UHD Blu-ray drive. The Series S doesn't. In terms of the GPU, like I've mentioned before, the Xbox One X does technically have a more powerful GPU than the Xbox Series S. It also has more graphics memory, more compute units, and higher memory bandwidth. But there's a catch. The Xbox One X is CPU limited, among other things. All of the Xbox One consoles, including the Xbox One X, use AMD's Jaguar architecture, whereas the new Series consoles use AMD Zen 2. And not only that, but it's limited to HDMI 2.0 instead of 2.1, and while it does have more memory, it's only GDDR5 instead of GDDR6. And again, games are loading off of a 5400 RPM hard drive, and even in a best case scenario, games are still loading off of an internal SATA connection that caps out at 750 megabytes per second, or off of an external SSD, which is 625 megabits per second, courtesy of USB 3. For context, the Xbox Series S and X use the same custom SSD, which gives you 2.4 gigabytes per second, so it's not even a competition. But don't worry, because it's not all bad news for the Xbox One X, because while the weaker CPU that it has does tend to limit its frame rates compared to the Xbox Series S, it does focus on a higher resolution output than the Xbox Series S, often leaning more towards 4K or as close as it can get while playing at between 30 to 60 FPS. So if you're like me and you just want more of a cinematic, high-resolution experience on a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, then the Xbox One X is perfectly capable of outputting native 4K in that game of all games, while sticking to a rock-solid 30 FPS. Just don't expect anything like 120 FPS, upscaling, image reconstruction from lower resolutions, or ray tracing. If you want those things, and you don't mind compromising on GPU performance or a lack of a disk drive, the Xbox Series S might be the one you want to go with for an extra $200. Although based on the size of games nowadays, it might be wise to put aside another $150 for one of those little SSD expansion cards, or just spring for the 1TB version of the Xbox Series S. Dealer's choice. Now, the last way I want to look at this Xbox is on its own as a game console in 2025. What does the game release schedule look like? How's support for newer games and services? And how do modern games look on this aging hardware? Well, first off, there really aren't many AAA titles coming out for this console anymore. You've got FL25, F124, and Black Ops 6 to name a few, but don't expect games like Indiana Jones or Forza Motorsports to be playing natively on this thing. Developers already have to make games for two Xbox consoles with extremely different performance levels, so having them develop for those and an Xbox with a totally different CPU and GPU architecture just doesn't make financial sense for most developers. Especially since making a game work on the Xbox One X means they also have to make it work on the original Xbox One. You know, the little slim white thing, or the big-ass VCR that came out in 2013. So yeah, I would understand why optimizing for that thing is just completely unreasonable in 2025. There are alternatives, however, to playing these newer games on this hardware. Not directly, unfortunately, but if you have Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, you can use cloud gaming to play these newer titles. It's not perfect. Input latency and compression artifacts are unfortunately noticeable in more demanding games or busy environments, but at least it lets you experience these games without having to get a new console yet. But for me personally, it still doesn't beat being able to play natively. My prediction is that this will likely be the last year that new titles will come out for the Xbox One X, but they're probably still going to keep it on the Xbox network and allow for older titles to be purchased and eventually sunset it the same way they sunset the Xbox 360. Years after the console was relevant, and you'll still be able to download your existing titles, just not purchase any new ones. But that is a long time from now. I mean, because think about it for a minute. The Xbox One X is from the 8th generation of consoles, and the Series X and Series S are from the 9th generation of consoles, and we are 4 years into the 9th generation of consoles, and only now are developers really starting to leverage the power of these 9th generation consoles to the point where it's not worth making it on the 8th generation of consoles anymore. So in terms of support, I'm not worried about the Xbox One X just because it's been that good for this long, and while games might not be coming out for it anymore, the support for old games will still be there. And I mean, even with that being said, the 9th generation finally being leveraged enough that they don't want to make games for the 8th generation of consoles, it's still not doom and gloom because the Xbox One's library is massive and looks amazing on this console, especially for games that are specifically optimized for the Xbox One X. And when it comes to accessories, well, they're Xbox accessories, so if you see the Xbox Jewel, it's just going to work. Doesn't matter if it's a launch controller from 2013, doesn't matter if it's a Series 2 Elite controller from whenever those came out, or even if it's an Xbox Series console, they will all work on all of these consoles. It's freaking awesome. And unlike when the Xbox One first came out, backwards compatibility is amazing. Xbox 360 games and even original Xbox games will play on this thing and usually look as good or better than they did on their original hardware. So to kind of wrap up here, the Xbox One X has pretty much reached the end of its life as a modern console with only a few games coming out for it in the year 2025, but because of the massive Xbox One, Xbox 360, and even the OG Xbox game library, in my opinion, it is still a console worth picking up in 2025. Not for the most modern titles, unless you want to use that cloud gaming option that I mentioned, but it is worth picking up in 2025 because, in my opinion, it is still the best budget 4K gaming console that money can buy. But either way, that's been it. Hopefully that kind of settles my whole thought on the Xbox One X in 2025 as a budget 4K gaming console, because that short was not enough information, and hopefully this was. But if you have more questions or you just want to let me know what you all think, go ahead and leave some comments down below. And if you like this kind of content and you want to see more like it, maybe leave this video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe if you want to see more like it. And as always, thank you all so much for being here, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one.